gig economy existed long before the pandemic. From one point of view, the gig economy is liberating. It gives knowledge workers opportunities they otherwise had no access to. With the friction of transaction being minimized, both freelancer and employer can be better off for the collaboration. From the other extreme, it's a repressive way for big bad corporations to exploit low-wage workers through outsourcing behind the cold indifference of a freelancing platform. If we want the truth, we have to go to the data. Analysis of the gig economy suggests it can be a polarizing effect, being a great opportunity for some and a grift for others. All that and more on today's episode of Data Skeptic.
My name is Fabian Braesemann. I am a research fellow and data scientist at the University of Oxford. They're working in the Future of Real Estate initiative at Said Business School, and I'm a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute.
Before we get into our core topic, would you mind telling us a little bit more about the Future of Real Estate initiative?
The Future of Real Estate initiative is a research center at the Said Business School that is looking into all major technological and innovative trends around the built environment. So there we look into the future of work, of course, the way real estate is transacted, the future of housing, talking about the housing bubble and housing crisis that we all observe living in metropolitan areas. And this is an initiative funded by different industry organizations. So through this initiative, we have organized numerous workshops and published a large number of reports on different topics like PropTech, so the startup environment within real estate, as well as all these topics I just mentioned.
When it comes to remote work and the gig economy and things like that, how much scholarship was there as you started getting into this? Is there a good body of research, or is it really new for academics to look at this?
So the term remote work, to my understanding, hasn't shown up very intensively in research pieces. I've looked onto Google Scholar quite a bit to find related work for our own study that we're going to talk about here with the title The Polarization of Remote Work. So, of course, in order to relate this as closely as possible to the existing body of literature, I looked onto Google Scholar and I haven't found much. So the concept is not new, obviously. There were many different words for it, like telecommuting, working from home, all these kind of things. But they have not been a major topic of research, I would say, until 2020.
And is that because of the pandemic, or was this a natural progression that was happening anyway?
No, absolutely. This is definitely because of the pandemic. And I think I'm quite sure about this just because of our research at the Oxford Internet Institute on internet geography led by Professor Mark Graham, and a project called iLabor, so on remote work platforms led by Professor Willele Donwirter. There we have looked into these online gig economies, freelancing platforms for quite some time. But before the pandemic, they have been looked at just, one outcome of the general trend toward digitalization and towards automatization. So actually other topics related to this, particularly computerization or automation of tasks, think of the famous Frey and Osborne paper, they have been looked at in much more detail in the past, I would say, compared to remote work enabled by digital technologies.
And are there analogies that you'll draw? Like you said, there are some old ideas. Should we have an assembly line where one person does a single task, or a specialist who runs the whole assembly line themselves? And I guess the answer varies a lot by industry. I've not looked deep into any research on that, but are there physical or historic wisdom that we can take and apply to the digital world, or is it fundamentally different?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Without going into too many details here on the history, there is quite a long history of conversations about the effect of communication technologies on how and where we work. This has started already at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where we saw first telecommunication technologies like the telegraph, then the early telephone popping up, changing how economic structures interact with each other. And we have looked into this in more detail with regards to the history of information communication technologies and the urban-rural divide in a paper with exactly the same title, ICTs and the Urban-Rural Divide, Can Online Labor Markets Bridge the Gap? And what we discussed there in this study and found out is that there were quite some almost naive hopes starting in the 1960s, 1970s already, that the city itself would essentially disappear just because of this rearranged interaction between the countryside and the city through these technologies that would enable a faster exchange of information, knowledge, and hence office-based work, I would say. And so what we see now under the umbrella term remote work, related to the pandemic from 2020 onward is really a revival of these old hypotheses, old theories. One of these papers, for example, that I would like to mention is one of these books that was quite famous, is a book called The Flat World. It led to a hypothesis that actually just because of the internet, we now are in a flat world again, where there is no advantage for people living in big metropolitan areas. So we know there is quite a long history, but again, all of this got a big revival just because now, eventually, we got a huge uptake, a huge adoption of technologies, just as we do right now, a Zoom call, a Teams call, whatever digital tool can be used to enable interaction between people at the other end of the globe.
Yeah, I'm a citizen of Los Angeles, California. It's not the most expensive place in the country to live, but certainly there are cheaper places I could have moved to, even though I've been sequestered at home now for a couple of years. I didn't make that move, but I know it's a simple arithmetic a lot of people did. That's to say, can I be a knowledge worker in a cheaper place? Maybe I should move to somewhere more rural. That sort of general sentiment is in the air, but are there any numbers that can help us understand if that's a real phenomenon or not? Has there been this digital diaspora?
We have come across these terms like these digital nomads going to different places, going to holiday resorts, wherever nicer places to work and live instead of being in their ghost cities that are of not much value in times of lockdowns and pandemics. But what we see in the research is that there are huge agglomerative forces that pull high-skill types of job and knowledge-intense jobs towards metropolitan areas. And this seems to be almost like a natural force, like a natural law, something that is just much stronger than these, as you just said, obvious calculations. Yeah, living is cheaper in the countryside. But at the same time, if you think of the network opportunities a large metropolitan area gives you, is it really worth it? So not talking just about the rent, but all the other, of course, lifestyle element that you might face in metropolitan areas, which you wouldn't have access to in rural areas, but particularly regarding the workplace, regarding the opportunities you have if you work in a metropolitan area. This seems to be things that rather lead to more urbanization than less.
It strikes me as being a little bit counterintuitive that as long as I have an internet connection, which obviously that can be an issue in some rural areas, but certainly you could find somewhere to get a good internet connection, it seems like that's all I need. Is there any way we can quantify or start looking at data sets to quantify these factors and understand them a little bit more at the scale you're talking about?
Before we come to the data, I would just like to repeat the overall logic I think that is important to think of. The obvious idea is, okay, now we, at any given point in time, particularly affected by the pandemic right now, I'm the person that I am with the job I have, so I can now move to the countryside, work there, pay less rent, and this is obviously a clever calculation. Though this is only a very short-term, short-sighted view on the whole situation, because people get the qualification and the connections and the job they actually have to do the work they have it from somewhere. And most often, this education, the specialized vocational training, the personal network you have, this all is related to place-bound institutions. And these place-bound institutions, particularly universities, colleges, higher education, laboratories, and particularly specialized forms of occupation, they most often cluster in large cities. And because of this clustering of the industrial educational side, people are also tend and pull toward these places. So why is it that we see clustering of specialized occupations in large cities? It is just because the city is essentially a network. The more people gather in a city, so the larger the city, the more potential connections between people, the more specialized types of services and occupations you can offer. So these laws always pull people towards cities. And this is a very important agglomerative force that needs to be taken account if you think of it in terms of how the difference between the countryside and the city will be affected by things like the pandemic.
I'm going to ask you a very unfair question because it's sort of about the far future and there's no way we can know. But just to get your thoughts, since you've been studying this, could it be that that is just an artifact of a shift in culture, that people my age and older aren't really good at forming online relationships, so they still do it related to physical geography, but perhaps the younger digital native generation, they'll be very comfortable making relationships online, and this effect could decline with time? Is there any reason to think that there's something important about physical proximity?
Yes, so the question is about the difference between physical proximity and online virtual proximity. I think you are right in so far that definitely the younger generation is more used to these tools, but at the same time, it is not replacing all these points of tacit knowledge exchange, connections, the famous water cooler chat or coffee machine chat that you could have. So these things are in place, and I think they will always be of importance. Just because the network of interactions, if you think of it like this, is not happening just on the work-related calls, not on the management of tasks, whatever, let's say, this podcast we're just doing right now, or just an email that we could send about particular topics, but it is also around the overall social element, the societal element that comes with it. As colleagues, as co-workers, you tend to exchange more beliefs, aspirations, ideas than you just do in a formal chat. So I think this is of importance and will always be of importance.
Well, I see a lot of really good scientific ideas here, but I don't know where to begin. How can we quantify some of these concepts and measure them?
Yeah, this is a complicated task, particularly taking into account, I mean, as you're saying in the description of the podcast now in 2022, of course, we have more data about how work has developed than we had in early 2020 through the pandemic, but still it is difficult to measure the effect of remote work. If you were lucky working as a data scientist with Zoom or Teams or Google or Skype, you probably have the ability to get data about all the connection calls being made. But as the average internet researcher, as the average person, you can't access that kind of data or mobile phone data. So we ask ourselves the question, is there any other kind of data that we could look at, which is telling us something about remote work, even though it might just be one particular element of the labor market? And what we looked at is data from so-called online freelancing platforms. These platforms, they are very similar to Amazon or eBay. So it is people offering something online and it is bought by others. But here we don't talk about commodities, not like on eBay or Amazon, but services. So things like website development, accounting, any other thing, any other type of job that you don't need a face-to-face interaction to. And these platforms have become major players in the global exchange of outsourcing services. So they are in place for roughly 10 to 15 years. The largest of these platforms, Fiverr, Upwork, Freelancer, and a few others. Amazon Mechanical Turk might be one that is more well known, but this is a platform for microtasks. So we looked into one of these platforms that is covering the full spectrum of knowledge work that could be mediated remote.
Gotcha. And let's dig more into what you had available there. Can you describe a little bit about what the data set contains?
First of all, where did we get the data from? So at the Oxford Internet Institute, thanks to Willy Donnerwerter's and Otto Cassi's work on the so-called Online Labor Index, the world's largest and most comprehensive index covering the online freelancing or online gig economy, we have API access to certain online labor platforms. Through this API access, we got the individual IDs of certain projects that have been conducted there. And through this API and these project IDs, we could get information about a large number of projects, detailed information, what kind of job is it, what was the average wage, what was the total project amount, and particularly interesting for us here, where the location of the employer and the employee, not only on the country level, but on a country-city level. And thanks to that data, we could look into how online freelancing markets, as a part of the labor market which is conducted and mediated remotely, how the geographies look like and how they have developed over time on a global scale.
Well, the amount paid should be pretty clear and transparent in the data because, of course, the money changed hands, easy to track. And the countries, we know things by IP address. But I'm imagining the rest of the details about the actual job might be fairly unstructured. Could just be a text description where I could write, HTML designer and you could write web producer, and it's essentially the same thing. What's the process for munging this data into something that you can categorize in a nice way?
Really good question, Kyle. And this is at the core of the data science or data mining approach we worked on with this project, with this paper. Again, so the first major thing is, thanks to this API, we could, in a very long and cumbersome and tedious process, because we wanted to respect the rate limit of the API, we could get the online data from the platform. And we ended up with a full transaction record data set of almost 2 million projects. That was really good. But this, as you're saying, is only half it, because we have locations written in different forms, even though there is some curation by the platform. Think of cities that have the same name in different places. So you have a couple of cities in the United States that have have cities with the same name in Europe. For example, there's an Oxford in UK, but also one in the United States. But you also have cities where usually different types of spelling are used. So think of St. Petersburg in Russia, for example. You could write St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg, all these kind of things. You could use Cyrillic letters. And so the second most relevant step for us to look into the global geography of the online labor market and on the remote work market was to geocode all the data. For this, we just used a very well-known tool. We used the Google Geocoding API, which gave us geo-coordinates of the city centers that were estimated from the data. A lot of manual processing and cleaning of the data then was still needed, but through that approach, we could get 2 million online projects geocoded on the country city level, which we could then relate to World Bank data, OECD data, and data from a really cool tool called the Global Data Lab, which is providing sub-national statistics for more than 100 Global South countries. So this was the second step. And the third one, as you just indicated, was the difficulty to really understanding and comparing occupations, because we wanted to look into the different types of jobs that are mediated online, and we wanted to understand whether we see any differences with regards to the wage level, to the competition and other occupation level characteristics. But at the same time, we didn't want to stick to the taxonomy used on the platform. The platform obviously uses a taxonomy that might be particularly designed for the target audience, so for potential employers on the platform. So there are many digital-like names like search engine optimization and other types of jobs that do not necessarily have an official occupation taxonomy equivalent. Another freely available online tool, which has been provided by the National Institutes of Health, a tool called SOCCA. Why SOCCA? Because it is relating free text information to the standard occupation classification, SOC. The National Institute of Health, they developed this tool for epidemiological research purposes so that they could understand whether there's particular occupational risks for people working in different job types. But anyhow, we use this tool with a large data set of 300,000 projects to map the online data to a total amount of 47 occupations. Obviously, these occupations are not randomly distributed across the whole spectrum of jobs. They are all relatively focused towards digital jobs, communication jobs, computer jobs, communication, and finance and accounting.
Are there any broad observations you have out of those 2 million jobs that could maybe help give some perspective to the listeners in terms of, the min and max on the wage or the average wage, or just what the composition is? What sort of jobs are out there that are being done remotely?
So in terms of the minimum and maximum wage, there could be some errors in the data. So let's better focus on the average than the median. So looking into certain types of jobs. So for example, what do we have here? We have jobs in the area legal and technical writing that had a median wage of $16, or jobs in business and finance, average median wage of $15, but also lower paying jobs like admin support types of jobs, just $5. Though I have to say, this is global averages, and most of the jobs is conducted in global south countries. But this is directly pointing towards one of the main features we see in this global online labor market, and hence maybe also in a future global remote labor market. We see that very much like we see that jobs are pulled towards metropolitan areas and to certain, if you want to say it, like attractor states, attractor places. So obviously in a global labor market, jobs go to places with relatively low wage levels, controlling for very important other effects like local educational level and infrastructure.
Could you help frame that $5 an hour? I know that's on the low side, but here in the U.S., that would not be an acceptable or even a legal rate that's below a minimum wage. Is that a predatory rate in other countries, or are there places because the cost of living is different that could be a viable, decent wage?
Yes, absolutely. This is definitely behind this. And I don't have the concrete numbers here at the moment, but clearly there is different wage levels per country. So maybe to tell you the average wage that we saw in the United States, for example, the average wage in the United States is something like $22. So definitely higher than these $5 we just reported about. But overall, between countries and also within countries, you see a huge spread. But obviously, as a wage like $5 is so low that only in very few places of the world you could afford a good living with such a low wage, you see that only platform workers from particular regions of the world are able to offer projects for such a low wage level. But I have to say, the platforms do something about it. They have come up with certain minimum wage schemes in order to avoid such low predatory wages.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Well, you had described the mapping process, getting us to 47 distinct occupations, and it sounds like that's a standard taxonomy. Is that useful then in comparing and contrasting the data?
Yes, absolutely. So the standard taxonomy, I think, is a very important step here. We are obviously not the only research group in the world using such a taxonomy. Instead, it is widely used, and there is a big movement within online research, I would say, where online types of jobs or online advertisements are mapped towards official taxonomies. Obviously, this is always a bit of a complicated process just because as the labor market is evolving and developing very quickly, the taxonomies will only be accurate looking backwards. And as the labor market, is updating, particularly in these times of fast technological progress, a taxonomy will never be perfectly up to date. So with regards to online job advertisement and other types of job descriptions, there has been a lot of research on this, but to our understanding, to our knowledge, we are the first group that mapped online freelancing jobs to such a standard occupation classification, which is used, for example, in the United States and in the United Kingdom.
Are there any immediate differences when you look at the online versus offline statistics?
Yeah, definitely. There are many, many differences. And we just talked about the wage level. In general, you can hardly compare this. Why? Just because a job taking place offline, so taking place in the real world, however you want to frame this, obviously is embedded in a legal setting. It just has very different basic conditions that limit the potential variance of the wage in any given city, just because the laws of supply and demand, they are regulated by geographies, by the legal system. On the other hand, in the online world, the laws of supply and demand, they work fully unrestrained. They are fully unleashed. It is a global market. So everyone, as you just said earlier, with a computer and internet connection could theoretically become an online freelancer. And this is something that could be of relevance to many of us working in potentially outsourceable and potentially automatizable types of jobs. As we had these large-scale adoption of digital technologies, it is of less importance where most of your work is being done, whether it's from your home office, whether it's from your living room or from the headquarters, the central business district. It could be that more parts of the overall labor market become organized in a similar way like the online freelancing platforms, so becoming more of a global labor market. And we have seen a lot of business process outsourcing over the past couple of years, also by smaller companies, startups, and the online platforms we investigate here, they are the best example that actually a lot of knowledge work can be outsourced nowadays.
Thanks to our annual sponsor, Weights and Biases, the developer-first ML platform. Weights and Biases is an enterprise-grade platform that gives you experiment tracking, dataset versioning, and model management. Their solution integrates with TensorFlow, sklearn, XGBoost, Hugging Face, and literally every other framework I could think of. Integrating with your model training process takes just a few lines of code, and there's even a nice live notebook on their site that'll show you how to get it going. Once your machine learning code base or notebook is wired up, you've just unlocked the next level of productivity. The Weights and Biases platform collects, aggregates, and beautifully displays all of your key metrics and telemetry so you can track your model training in real time and compare different runs. Have you ever had to screenshot a matplotlib graph that you drop in an email or in Slack to show your boss the results of your work? That's like serving a gourmet dinner in a cardboard box. With Weights and Biases, all of your collaborators can see the results of different runs with an idealized interactive suite of tools. You no longer have to be the single source of truth for your whole organization about how the model's doing. If you're on or leading a growing team of machine learning practitioners, you need to investigate if Weights and Biases is the right solution for you. Get started at w&b.me/dataskeptic and mention us when you request a demo. Thanks to our sponsor BB Edit from Bare Bones Software. If you're a Mac user and you have any need whatsoever for a text editor, which, let's face it, that's got to be all of us, you have got to check out BB Edit. BB Edit 14 provides Mac users the most powerful, professional-grade text editor around. It's known as capable and rock solid, and can process files that are large enough to bring other editors to their knees. This tool's been beloved for over 25 years, and I can understand why. If I'm just typing up some simple hello world, I guess any text editor will do. But when I really get into the weeds and need to do some data processing, maybe I've got a big messy file, I need to find all the non-ASCII characters and remove them, BBEdit's there for me. It has best-of-breed multi-file search and replace and great scripting support for text transformations. There's a whole menu of text transformations that you'll find handy. If you're a serious data scientist or software engineer, you're going to bump into situations where you need a powerful text editor. So download and try BBEdit today. You can get it at www.barebones.com. See how much your productivity can increase. barebones.com and download BBEdit. Can you break it down in terms of who's doing really well, who is not as well? If I want to really get a high wage on one of these online platforms, what profession should I be pursuing?
Yeah, in terms of the profession and in terms of the geography, this is where we see most of the polarization. This is why the title Polarization of Remote Work is the one we chose for this paper. So in terms of occupations, in general, there's a tendency from low to high skills, even though it's very difficult to measure high and low skills. But what I mean with this is the more specialized training you need, the more particular experience you need for a certain type of job, the less competition you will face in that job category, and this will generally lead to higher wages. So comparing different occupations, the general tendency is from low to high skill and from low competition to high competition. So those kind of jobs that require specialized types of education that are hard to copy, that need a long time of training or particular experiences, they will see less competition. They will often be smaller markets with less supply and less demand, and this is where in general wages are higher. To give you just a couple of examples, among the high-paying wages are jobs in mathematical and computer environment, things like data scientists or programmers. And among those jobs that got very low wages in the data set we looked at were people in the sales area like telemarketers or data entry keyers. But interestingly, there's certain types of jobs that do not require very particularly high formal education, but they still come with a competitive advantage that they require very hard to copy skills. The two job types that we found to have the highest average wages are paralegals and announcers. So paralegals obviously require particular experiences with the legal system of the employer. In most cases, the US, as the United States, is the largest buyer of online labor services. And announcers, equally, if you think of people that do voiceovers or advertisement videos online, they need a particular type of accent, like an US American accent, so this can also very hard. And therefore, we see that in general, the less competition, the higher the wage level.
At the other end of the polarization, who is being squeezed the hardest?
Those individuals that bring skills to the market that many other people can also offer. So you see things that do not require much more than computer and internet infrastructure. For example, things like data entry keyers. So data entry keying is basically transcribing digitized documents towards Excel spreadsheet, these kind of things that do not require any particular type of training. They see the lowest wages, and what's more, and this is a very important thing in the platform economy, it could be something that would be of relevance if more part of the labor market become like these labor markets from the platform economy, is importance of experience you need to get a job in the first place. So we came up with a new measure that we call the experience gradient, where we investigated the relevance of the number of previous projects you have as a freelancer to get the next job. And what we found is that this is also highly correlated with the overall market size. So the more fish there are on the sea, the more difficult it is for you to get a job, and with the competition, obviously, but also with the wage levels. So in general, so what we see is that those jobs that are very competitive, very large sub-markets within the overall platform economy, so with many people offering the services, those are the jobs where you see the lowest wage levels.
You also have all this rich geographic data. Do you see any trends in the way that's impacting the way local workers or local consumers of these services operate?
I think the geographical element is the most interesting aspect of our study here. Because again, we talked about the historical roots of these investigations. We talked about the flat world hypotheses and all these previous investigations that did foresee the end of the city or general more widespread distribution of economic activity. And clearly we see this on a global level. We all know of programmers in global south countries, in countries that just a couple of years or decades ago were not active in these areas of the economy. But if you look at the global distribution at the world map, we have a map and the paper here, the distribution is far from the flat world. we see that most of the demand comes from highly urbanized, high-income centers. In the US, it is at the coastal regions, so West Coast, East Coast, also same in Canada. In Europe, you see most demand coming from West Europe and North Europe. And the other big demand place is Australia and New Zealand. And most of the supply side, and this is the most interesting part because this is where the workers are, so where the employees, the remote employees of the future, they are in places with relatively low wages, but definitely not with the lowest wage levels of the world. So Africa and South America are unfortunately largely an empty spot on the map. And most of the online labor goes to South Asia, so Pakistan, India, Philippines, traditional outsourcing destinations, and a lot of the labor market goes to East Europe and Southeast Europe. So you see that it is particular places in the world that seem to provide a fertile ground for online freelancing communities to happen. And this is something that is of relevance for all of us talking about the difference between the countryside and cities with regards to remote work. Namely, you need certain types of institutions that tend to gather in metropolitan areas, also here in the online freelancing market, to offer you services, even though while you are online, while you're on the online freelancing platform, you work with clients from the other end of the globe.
So if I were to take a very as virtuous as possible that I can think of econometric perspective on this, I might say, well, we see that clustering, agglomerating into urban centers is a way of, amassing wealth for the people that are there and becoming a center of innovation. And then the revenue they're generating can flow out into these other markets and rural areas that might not have had access to that capital had the people in the urban area not innovated and generated it. That's sort of a loaded kind of perspective in a way. I don't know that describes the real world, but it might maybe describes the world I'd like to live in. Can we come to any conclusions about the dynamics of this system from the data you have? Are we headed in a good direction? Can a rising tide lift all ships?
Yes, so I think what you just described would be this optimistic scenario that many people would like to see. So wealth being generated, more wealth and innovation happening in metropolitan areas and slowly diffusing towards other parts of the world. From the data we looked at, the data set covers the years 2013 to 2020, so 8 years in total. We don't see any trend towards more ruralness. In contrast, if at all, the polarization between urban and rural areas seems to be quite constant, and the urban areas have become more important, particularly in global south countries. So talking about the inequality and the polarization between urban areas and rural areas, we see that overall the polarization has only increased. So for example, the share of projects in capital regions has increased by 1 percentage point over time in the period 2013 to 2020. So we saw in the OECD countries, we saw a share of 13% in capital regions, so in the major metropolitan areas in all the countries, and this increased to 20% over time. So we rather see more labor going towards metropolitan areas than less labor. And in overall, we see that the polarization seems to be quite constant, if not increasing.
Is there a possibility, just a hypothetical here, the physicists have dark matter for the matter they can't see. Could there be offline jobs, maybe agricultural, in these rural areas that need to be offset in some way to have a complete picture?
Absolutely, you're right. We are limited to the online data set here in this instance. What we're doing in one of our current research projects, we try to compare the online labor activity more to the on-site activities. So there we cannot go for global analysis. We do stick there to the United States as being a very large country, a very large economy with very good granular data on the county level for the labor market as well. And what we saw there is actually amplifying the results we have seen so far. So if there are enough institutions in a smaller city, so if there are the sufficient conditions fulfilled for people to be able to offer valuable jobs that are relevant for potential employers from the big metropolitan areas in rural environments, then you will see online activity happening. And particularly then the online labor goes to places with relatively low wage levels. So wherever there is the largest delta between the wage, for example, website developer would be paid in a metropolitan area like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, you name it, and a smaller city, then this job tends to go to these places. But again, the main requirement is that the institutions are there in any given place, enabling people to offer these types of skills. Or the distribution of these institutions, they seem to be shaped by agglomerative forces as well.
Yeah, the paper mentions the Rockefeller Foundation's Digital Jobs Africa project and Kenya's Ajira Digital. Are these the sort of efforts you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a particular interesting implication from our research. So, as we show in more detail in the paper with regards to the regression analysis, that it is actually particular types of infrastructure. So, the education level in the region, the income, particularly the internet connectivity, which is not surprising, but also as what we call the IT specialization of the economy. So, in how far the economy has a large number or large share of IT specialized industries and jobs. As they all influence the distribution on the labor markets, it is an unwise decision to just increase the supply in places that do not have the pre-requirements for a fertile online freelancer community. And this is, to some extent, what we criticize as an implication from the research. These foundations and initiatives, they want to utilize these technologies with a very great purpose in mind, namely to bring decent jobs to people in marginalized regions, to marginalized communities. But I'm not saying they do this, but if they accidentally increase the supply of those types of occupations, of those easy to copy, high competitive types of jobs, then they could not help the people in these environments, because they will not get a job in the first place, but they could make this situation even worse for freelancers in other areas of the globe. So what I want to say with this is many macro level results we see here in the online labor market, in the remote work market, so the wage level in particular, but also where the labor goes to, these are all shaped by system level dynamics that are largely out of the hands of the individual freelancers. But of course, with every individual action, so the decision I do as an employee to offer my job in a particular part of the labor market, in a particular type of the online freelancing economy, will have an effect on all other people. And if then obviously institutions bring in more supply while there is not enough demand, then wages will only go down and it will become more difficult for freelancers to get jobs.
Are you aware of any countries that have taken some of these lessons to heart and have a good plan for a rollout of economic development?
I mean, this is still a very new topic, I would like to say, and many of the policies are heavily debated within the academic community. And there's a few very interesting approaches. One is called a digital apprenticeship. So the idea that the first project is, because, we haven't talked about this one important element here, the one missing piece of the puzzle here. So why isn't that we see all these inequalities and all these uncertainties happening in this market? This is just because there is so much supply employers, so in general, there's less demand than supply. This gives a lot of market power to the buyer. But the employer obviously need to make a quick decision about the freelancer to hire for any particular type of job, the website development, the graphic design, whatever they want to do. So they have to use what is available on the platform. And these are particular types of trust queues. So the number of previous jobs being displayed, the feedback score, the reviews, the profile photo, and any other kinds of pieces of information. And given that there is cognitive limitations for employers to choose among this vast crowd of potential employees, they often go with these trust queues. And this is further accelerating these drivers of inequality, as people tend to hire those individuals that already have previous job, already have previous experience. So they get more experience, they get more jobs, they get higher wages, and this spirals upwards. And people without these previous jobs and without feedback, they have a very hard time to get their first job. And in order to overcome this, one clever idea is a digital apprenticeship, where you basically assign a first job without considering, at random, essentially, without considering any previous knowledge. And another very important policy that you could do as a country is obviously embrace these technologies, not from a supply side, but also from a demand side. Think about how maybe small public projects could be advertised online, could include online freelancers. And another very important aspect is the idea of coming up with third-party or external types of quality signaling. So as I just said, the platform signals are used quite heavily to drive market behavior. As an alternative, institutions like, for example, the European Commission or others, they could come up with their own quality scheme, third-party quality signaling mechanisms that could show the abilities of online freelancers independently of the platform metrics.
Interesting. Yeah, I think good directions that could definitely help these things grow. Is that the sort of feedback that the platform you collaborated with was looking for? Or was it really just about how to improve the overall transparency of data?
Yeah, I think these platforms, they are really keen to bring in as good as possible experience to both sides of the market, to the employers and the employees. So they're constantly working on these feedback mechanisms, and they clearly, to my understanding, are aware and are welcoming these numerous research pieces that are out there on these review scores and on these ways how to improve the platform. But what the essential finding of our study is that the overall macro dynamics and the macro patterns coming out of this online labor market are much less due to the platform architecture and the fact that these things are mediated by this or that particular online platform, but instead it is these overall large economic laws that drive the geographic and occupational inequalities we see. And this is why, in my opinion, these findings could be generalized beyond the platform case towards the future of work in general, just because more and more digital tools allow the modularization of tasks. We talked about this a bit at the beginning of our conversation today, a phenomenon which has been called digital Taylorism. So essentially the splitting up of tasks, very much like the assembly line, into individual bits and pieces, specialization of workers just on these individual pieces of the digital value chain. And thanks to online platforms, but also video conferencing tools and many more technologies, which have seen huge rise in adoption rates throughout the pandemic, could lead to more outsourcing and the platformization of knowledge work in general.
Is this essentially the conclusion of your research, or is this, phase one of a multi-part research project?
I mean, I have to say I worked on this project quite long. So this is the main work of my postdoc in Oxford. I started to work on this project in 2017 already, so a couple of years before the pandemic started. So you see, we were interested in this topic quite long before the pandemic already. And I think every good piece of research, in the end, you end up with more questions than answers. So thanks to the large data mining infrastructure, to all the methodological innovations we had here in terms of how to process the large online data and map it to geographical and economic taxonomies, we could get a first overview of the global distribution of online freelancing, of remote work in a platform environment on a global scale, both on a national and subnational level, but there's many more questions to come out of it. In particular, what we would like to look at in more detail is how these developments change over time. And very much would like to look into the individual skill and technology level. So how does the overall labor market react to innovations? So thinking of particular programming technologies, for example, to give just one example, when the machine learning framework TensorFlow was introduced in late 2015, we saw obviously a huge uptake in numerous online platforms and also in the online labor market of this technology. But what is the effect of such a novel innovation on the market as a whole? Is it that we see early adopters trying to claim these technologies and get higher wages there? Is it that related technologies like Python, because TensorFlow is based on Python, is it that we see higher wages in these technologies as well? And in general, how does the overall space of different technologies and skills, how does this network evolve over time, and how is this affecting the global distribution? And why would we want to look into these more detailed figures? Just because we believe that these general policies, like a global minimum wage, for example, might miss the real dynamics and the real interactions that shape the fate of freelancers globally.
Well, to know that these platforms, not the platforms themselves, just the dynamics of the system can be polarizing is a little disheartening for me. I'd much prefer to live in a world where they're empowering for all participants. With that in mind, are you optimistic about where remote work is heading?
Definitely, it is a great technology because in principle, it could lead to empowerment of people in regions without the institutions that would enable them to thrive economically otherwise. But in order to see these optimistic outcomes, to see these positive outcomes, I think a lot of research would be needed to really understand what the driving forces are that shape the geography, that shape the economic outcomes, and then only after this is understood to interfere and manage these. So, for example, we thought about an idea, this is clearly maybe far future for me personally, but hopefully not too long for the field itself, to use some kind of computer modeling, like agent-based modeling, for example, to use the data we gathered and the data that other people have gathered about the macro dynamics in these systems, in these online labor markets, and then calibrate computer models to better understand how the system, how the agents, so the online freelancers, react to different things. So in order to come up with cleverer, better, smarter policies than those types of policies that could, in the end, harm many freelancers.
Fabian, is there anywhere people can follow you online?
In general, we report about our research not only through the papers, but also we publish blog posts via the Oxford Internet Institute's blog website. But also in general, I'm more active on LinkedIn. With my name, you can find me easily. And every now and then when there's something to show off, I will always push it there.
Well, thanks so much for coming on Data Skeptic and sharing your work.
Thank you very much, Kyle. It was really a pleasure to talk about this research and be part of this exciting community.
That concludes another installment of Data Skeptic Physically Distributed. Thanks to our sponsors today, Weights and Biases, and BB Edit by Barebones Software. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as associate producer, Vanessa Bly, guest coordinator, show notes written by David Abembe, and our host, Kyle Polich.